It started like any other missing child case. But what Officer Daniel Collins was about to uncover would send shockwaves through the community, leaving scars that would last forever. The woods had always been a place of mystery, but what they were about to reveal would be far worse than anyone could imagine. The call came in just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. 7-year-old Ethan had vanished during a routine camping trip with his family near Alder Ridge, a sprawling forest notorious for its dense, maze-like terrain. The boy's parents had searched for him for hours before finally reporting him missing, their voices shaking with panic as they described how Ethan had wandered off to explore and never returned. For Officer Daniel Collins, a veteran on the force for over 15 years, missing persons cases weren't anything new. Children wandered off, especially in places like this. Usually it was a matter of retracing their steps and finding them before the panic truly set in. But something about this case felt different from the start. Ethan's father, usually stoic, couldn't meet Daniel's eyes when he recounted what had happened. And his mother, her hands were trembling in a way that suggested this was more than a typical case of a lost boy. As Daniel stood at the edge of the forest, watching the treetops sway in the fading light, a cold shiver crept down his spine. There was something eerie about these woods, something he couldn't quite place, like a weight hanging in the air that made it hard to breathe. The search team was ready, flashlights on, radios buzzing with quick chatter, and the sound of boots crunching on the dry leaves as they prepared to sweep the area. This will be over in no time, Daniel thought, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread in his chest. Ethan had likely just gotten lost, and they'd find him huddled under a tree, scared but unharmed. At least that's what Daniel told himself as he and his partner, Officer Frank, stepped into the thick underbrush. The farther they walked into the forest, the darker it became. The canopy above was dense, blocking out most of the remaining daylight. Their flashlights sliced through the gloom, but the woods seemed to swallow the light almost immediately, as if reluctant to give up its secrets. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes had Daniel on edge. He had been through these woods dozens of times, but tonight it felt different, sinister even. They moved in silence, calling Ethan's name every few minutes, their voices bouncing off the trees and echoing into the distance. There was no response, not a sound, just the unnerving quiet of the forest, which felt heavier with each passing moment. After nearly an hour of searching, Daniel spotted something unusual in the dirt. Small, distinct footprints. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. "Frank, over here," he said, kneeling down to get a closer look. Frank joined him, shining his flashlight on the prints. "That's him, right?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Daniel nodded. "It has to be. They're too small to be anyone else." With renewed urgency, they followed the trail deeper into the woods. The tracks were steady at first, but after a few minutes, they began to change. Staggering, uneven, as if Ethan had been running. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Something had scared the boy. That much was clear. But what? Suddenly the footprints stopped. Daniel and Frank stood frozen, staring at the ground in disbelief. The tracks simply vanished, with no sign of where Ethan had gone or what might have happened. The area around them was undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no additional footprints leading away. It was as if the boy had been lifted off the ground and carried into the air. "What the hell?" Frank whispered, his eyes wide with confusion. Daniel didn't respond. His instincts were screaming at him that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He reached for his radio and reported the discovery to the other teams. They needed to widen the search area. But deep down, Daniel knew that finding the boy might not be as simple as they had first thought. As they pressed on, the air grew colder, and the forest around them seemed to close in. The trees were taller and older here, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. It felt suffocating. The kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where every step deeper into the woods felt like stepping back into a different world. Then they heard it. A sound so faint it could have been their imagination, but it was there. A soft, high-pitched whimper, like the cry of a child. Daniel's heart leapt. "Ethan!" he called, his voice cracking with urgency. They both strained to listen, their breaths shallow, waiting for another sound. And then it came. A weak, desperate sob. "This way!" Daniel shouted, his pulse racing as he took off in the direction of the sound, Frank close on his heels. The underbrush thickened, branches clawing at their uniforms as they barreled through the trees, determined to reach the boy. After what felt like an eternity, they burst into a small clearing, and that's when they saw it. A cabin, old and decrepit, standing in the middle of the woods like some forgotten relic. Its windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, but the sobs were coming from inside. Daniel's stomach twisted with unease. Something about the place didn't feel right, but there was no time for hesitation. They approached the door cautiously, their hands hovering over their holsters, ready for anything. "Ethan," Daniel called again, his voice steady but tense. A child's voice responded, barely audible through the thick wooden door. "Help me, please." Daniel's heart broke. He motioned for Frank to cover him as he slowly pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the stillness of the night. Inside, the cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. In the far corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, towering over the small boy, was a figure. Daniel couldn't make out the details at first, but as his flashlight swept over the room, the beam landed on the figure's face. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, clutching a knife. Daniel's training kicked in instantly. "Drop the weapon," he shouted, drawing his gun and stepping between the man and Ethan. Frank had his gun trained on the man as well, ready to fire if necessary. The man didn't move. His eyes darted between the officers and the boy, his grip on the knife tightening. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice shaky and hoarse. "I had to take him. I had to." Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. "Put the knife down, and we can talk. Just let the boy go." For a moment, it seemed like the man might listen. His eyes softened, and his grip on the knife loosened slightly. But then, as if something snapped inside him, he lunged toward Ethan, the knife raised high. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the cabin, piercing the tense silence. The man crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering from his hand. Daniel's chest heaved as he rushed to Ethan, scooping the boy into his arms. The boy was shaking, his tiny body trembling with fear. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, holding Ethan close. "You're safe now." The cabin was quiet again, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Frank radioed for backup, his voice steady but grim. The situation was far from over. The man's cryptic words, "I had to take him," echoed in Daniel's mind, sending chills down his spine. Why had he taken Ethan? What was he planning to do? And, most disturbingly, were there more children? As the sound of distant sirens approached, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this case was only beginning to unravel. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the truth would become. And as you're watching this unfold, remember, what we just uncovered is only the tip of the iceberg. You'll want to stick around because there's much more to this story. But before we dive deeper, show your support for Ethan and his family by giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The investigation that followed shook the town to its core. What the police found hidden in those woods, a cabin no one knew existed, was only the beginning. As the investigation deepened, the details that emerged were more chilling than anyone could have anticipated. The cabin, hidden away in the thickest part of the forest, was far older than anyone could have imagined. It had been abandoned for decades, a relic of an era long past. Yet, in recent months, someone had made it their home. The man who had taken Ethan was no stranger to the woods, nor was he an ordinary criminal. Daniel couldn't get the man's words out of his head. I had to take him. It was such an odd, eerie statement. What did he mean by that? As officers combed through the cabin and the surrounding woods, they found disturbing evidence that suggested the man had been stalking the area for quite some time. Old newspaper clippings, photos of children taken from a distance, and journals filled with ramblings about protecting children from some unnamed danger. But the most haunting discovery was what they found, buried behind the cabin. Officers digging through the dirt unearthed small, crude graves. It sent shockwaves through the search teams, and everyone feared the worst. However, when the forensic team arrived, they confirmed that, while disturbing, the graves held nothing more than old dolls, some dressed in tattered children's clothing. It was as if he had been rehearsing for something more sinister. Daniel felt a pit in his stomach. The man had clearly been planning to escalate, and Ethan could have been his first real victim if the police hadn't intervened. The relief of having saved Ethan was immense, but the gravity of what they had uncovered hung over Daniel like a dark cloud. Who was this man? And why had he gone unnoticed for so long? The police ran a background check on the man, identifying him as someone who had lived on the fringes of society for years. He had no family, no friends, and no known employment. The locals knew him as Old Joe, a harmless recluse who rarely came into town and always kept to himself. But clearly, there had been much more going on beneath the surface. His journals hinted at an obsession with protecting children. But from what? The ramblings were incoherent, but one thing was clear. He believed he was on a mission, driven by some delusion that he had to save these children. As the investigation continued, Daniel and the other officers scoured the town for more information. They talked to the few people who had ever interacted with Old Joe. A local shopkeeper recalled him buying supplies every now and then, always in cash, and never speaking more than a few words. A nearby farmer mentioned seeing him wandering the woods late at night, but he'd thought nothing of it at the time. The man had lived in the shadows, unnoticed, but always lurking. The town was shaken to its core. Parents became more protective of their children, holding them closer, wondering how long this man had been watching. But for Daniel, it was more personal. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan in that cabin, terrified, huddled in the corner. The boy had been lucky, but the next child might not be. Weeks passed and the story became national news. People couldn't believe that such horror had been hiding in their midst. And yet, there was still a piece of the puzzle missing. Old Joe's motivations remained unclear, and despite all the evidence they had collected, they still didn't know how long he had been watching or if there were others involved. One night, as Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the case pressing on him, his phone buzzed. It was an alert from the station, an update on the case. Daniel opened it, his heart racing. They had managed to unlock one of Old Joe's final journals, the one found hidden deep in the cabin. The entries were disturbing, filled with paranoia and cryptic references to saving children from an unknown threat. But one passage stood out to Daniel. Old Joe had written about the woods calling, about how the forest wanted the children. It was the ravings of a disturbed mind, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The woods had always had an eerie reputation. But could there be something deeper? Something that had driven Old Joe to his delusions? It was a thought that haunted Daniel as the case began to close. The town slowly returned to normal, but the fear never fully went away. The cabin was destroyed, the land marked as dangerous and off limits to anyone, but the memory of what had happened there lingered. Ethan, though shaken, began to heal with the help of his family. He rarely spoke about his time in the cabin, and Daniel respected his need for privacy. The boy was safe, and that was what mattered most. But for Daniel, the case was never truly over. He continued to patrol the edges of the woods, watching, waiting, wondering if the forest would give up any more of its secrets. And as you're here, watching this, I want you to think about the unseen dangers that can exist right in our own backyards. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't what we can see, but what we don't. If this story moved you, if it kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support helps bring awareness to stories like Ethan's, and maybe even helps prevent the next one from happening. Stay safe, everyone. With the investigation officially closed, the community tried to move forward. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the woods held more secrets. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig sent his mind racing back to that night in the cabin. And though Old Joe was gone, the fear he had sown still lingered. For months after, Daniel continued to keep a close eye on the woods. He patrolled the area more frequently, stopping by where the cabin once stood, as if waiting for something, or someone else, to emerge from the shadows. And while the town moved on, the memory of what had happened there would remain with Daniel forever, a constant reminder of how quickly life can turn dark. Daniel had saved Ethan that night, but he knew that the woods hadn't given up all their secrets. Maybe they never would. And with that, I'll leave you with this question. How well do you really know your surroundings? Let this story serve as a reminder to always stay vigilant. You never know what might be lurking where you least expect it. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories that might just leave you thinking twice about the world around you. Thanks for watching.